Sydney. I am one half of the Good People's Group in a center on interracial relationships with my business partner, Liana. And I'm also a birth worker, which means that I help people who are in labor or like a little bit later in their pregnancy, all the way through until just after they have a baby. But what Liana and I do together that we're going to talk about today is we talk about how to be in relationships. So let's say if you're in a relationship with someone and you have different pieces of your identity. So I'm white. Liana identifies as an Afro-Latinx person, Afro-Brazilian. But the race is only one way that we can be in relationships with people that are different from our identities. My partner identifies as male, I identify as female. We can have all kinds of different income levels and be friends. And relationships, and that extends to our family too. Like not all of our families look exactly the same, right? And some of us are closer with our biological families. Some of us are closer with our chosen families. Some of us have a mix of the two. So what I wanted to talk to you all about today is how do we know when someone is supporting us and protecting us, and how do we know when we're doing the same for them? So a lot of times we throw around this word ally. Don't know if anyone's heard of that, but it's what we refer to someone who doesn't share our identity. And first, let me back up. When we're talking about oppression, right? So like things like racism or sexism or homophobia. So an ally would be someone who is not, in the instance of racism, a Black person, an Asian person, a person of color. And so I would be an ally towards people of color if I am also fighting against racism. So we're talking about like when you're in a relationship with someone and you come into a situation where your identity is threatened and you're wanting that person to sort of like stick up for you or have your back. And I'm sure we've all had those moments where we thought somebody was going to be that protection for us and they weren't. But it's kind of hard to identify. We don't always know for sure. And so the first step that we can do when we're in a situation where we can tell, like, for instance, for me, say I'm like, oh, one of those teachers said something about how I'm not intelligent enough because of being a girl or something like that, right? And I have a friend who's a male partner or a masculine person, and I'm kind of hoping like, that they would stick up for me in that situation, and they don't. What do you do? Well, the first thing, that's the most important thing, is that you check in with yourself. Always, 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 this is the first thing to do. Sometimes it's very obvious when we're experiencing oppression and some of our friends or the people around us are not coming to support us. They're not being allies. But sometimes it's a little bit trickier, right? It's hard. It's not always very, very overt when people are racist or sexist or classist. Sometimes it's kind of more covert. And so, what always we'll know is our bodies always know. And so when you're in a situation and you're feeling like, I'm not totally sure, that was a little weird, I don't feel, I feel like that might have been something that was oppressive that happened to me and I don't feel protected. Close your eyes, take a couple deep breaths, step away from the situation if you can, and check in physically, right? And the more that we do this, the more that we're able to actually know where oppression kind of lives in our physical reactions, because we're getting triggered. That's what that is. So it looks differently for everyone. So for instance, for me, when I experience that, sometimes my heart will start racing, or I'll get like, and it'll be kind of hard for me to talk. Like I'll feel like a dry mouth, dry throat. Sometimes my heart starts racing. For other people, they get mad and their ears get hot. That's one I hear a lot. Or their face, they might get really flushed, or they might lose all the color in their face, right? So it's super important for us to check in with ourselves physically and say, that's the very first thing we do. What's going on with me and where is it showing up? And if we do that over and over again, we get really familiar with, when, let's say when I experience sexism, I know specifically, it always shows up physically like this for me. My heart always starts racing, right? If it's something else, maybe my hands get clammy, but there are these very particular ways that I experience sexism. So that's the first step. We always want to check in with ourselves. Check in with yourself when you're in a situation, when you're around certain people. So sometimes people make us nervous and our bodies react. Our bodies react. They know when we're safe and they know when we're not so safe. Or they know when we're in danger. And so we think a lot. We can kind of get stuck in our heads a lot, but our bodies are always the first place that we want to check in when we're not sure if we are safe or not, or if someone is really being an ally to us. So always do that first, and then ask yourself, what are you feeling too emotionally, right? So you kind of check in physically with what happens, and then be like, how do I feel? Do I feel sad? Do I feel angry? And like, where did we're attaching that feeling to like the physical place that has shown up for us. The more that we do that, the more that we're able to like know what our body's reactions are sooner, and the less time we spend in an unsafe situation. So I know we've all had that happen where we thought somebody was our friend and we didn't know what to do about it once we found out that they didn't stick up for us in a certain situation. So for that's when we check in physically, and that's how we know when to set boundaries with people, right? So if you keep getting that feeling that you're like, oh, this friend of mine, my heart races when I'm around them. I don't feel safe. I do this or that, the other thing. That's when you know to set a boundary with somebody. But how do you know when you are actually the person who's not protecting someone else, right? So for me, when I have these conversations with Liana and we talk to people, families, friends, all kinds of different relationships, when we're talking about racism, my contribution to that conversation is specifically from the perspective of a white person. So you can kind of connect this to being, back to sexism, to classism, to disability justice and ableism. So for people who are considered mentally or physically disabled, or, all the ways we categorize people. So you can, if you don't identify as a white person, but you still want to reflect on having a position of privilege in the whole like system of oppression, you can connect it to any other system: disability, heteronormativity, homophobia, all of it. Whether or not you're a citizen, to like immigrant justice. So then how do we know? We know how to sort of identify when we need to protect ourselves, but then how do we know when we are maybe the one who is not being a good ally, right? How do we know when we're not protecting our friends and family when we should in situations of injustice? So the most important thing, I think, for us when we're thinking about being in a position where we have more power, right? So as a white person, I have more power in society. I have more access. There are laws that protect me in different ways than protect Asian people, Black people, Latinx people, Indigenous people. There are laws that protect me and give me more rights in the whole historical context. So I think the first thing that's important is like, we can't be neutral, right? We can't just say like, oh, I see oppression happening, but I'm not doing it, so I'm not contributing to it. But we can't be a bystander when it comes to oppression. And it's really important for us to know how we are also impacted by systems of oppression, even if we think we benefit from it, right? So it's not good for me and my humanity to not stand up for or protect or speak up when I see racism happening to my friends of color. It takes away from my humanity to not be protecting people in my life. So we also need to figure out how those same norms, the system of racism kind of like negatively impacts me too and shows up in my own life. So I'm, like I'd said, that one example of it takes away from my humanity. If I'm not protecting other human beings, if I think I'm better than other human beings, if I think it's not my responsibility to take care of everyone, not just other white people, then that takes away from my humanity as a person, right? Like I am, it's going to damage my relationships, my friendships with people that I care about, that I have like, mutual respect for. We support each other. But if I'm not holding up my end of the bargain, I'm going to be isolated and alone, and I'm going to have like pretty limited relationship depth. And I think that's what's important question to ask ourselves. I identify as physically able-bodied, but how does disability and ableism impact me, even if I'm able-bodied, right? It might impact the way I see myself. So for a long time, I didn't realize that, like, for me personally, I have a lot of like mental health around anxiety. So I saw myself as this able-bodied person. And so I thought, I don't need to worry about disability justice or ableism because that's not me. But I didn't realize that having anxiety is part of disability justice and part of ableism and that system of oppression. And so for me, not being invested in fighting ableism also negatively impacts my own life and my own sense of myself, right? So not only are we letting down all of the people in our life that we're supposed to be like interdependent and supporting, but we're also limiting ourselves. And so when it comes to not only protecting ourselves, but knowing whether or not we're a good ally, I think it comes down to us being able to ask ourselves, how does this impact my humanity and me, and being able to understand that we are all impacted by injustice, right? Like MLK had said, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And being able to really ask ourselves that question and learn to internalize that is super, super important when we're talking about interracial, inter-identity relationships, because that is where it is challenged the most and it comes to the surface most quickly.
Your voice